Hello, my name is Ryan Beam. I'm a student at the University of Kentucky studying economics and statistics. In this series, I just like to explore how data is applied in real world settings and how the field continues to evolve across industries and roles. Today, I'm joined by Thomas Modern, staff data scientist at Meta. Thank you so much for meeting with me today.
My pleasure. Glad to be on the pod with you, Ryan.
Really excited for it. And so, just to kind of get us started, I want to kind of hear a little bit about you and your career path because I know you studied economics at Colorado College, then got an MBA and a master's in analytics. So, could you just kind of walk me through maybe how that path unfolded and what were maybe some of the major pivots or decisions you had to make along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I would say that I was not very deliberate about my early career, and I kind of stumbled on that path. And over time, learned to be much more deliberate about my career. I think the way that you are approaching your early career by talking to professionals, doing this podcast, shows maturity far beyond what I had at a similar age. But for me, my initial curiosity was just about economics and business and understanding, kind of, just that world, and really not having a lot of context, but just choosing that as a major because it seemed to, be a productive path to pursue. And when I graduated from college, there was, maybe 2 to 3 years where felt pretty directionless, and was applying for jobs, not getting much traction for entry level roles. And that was, really after undergrad, I realized that, okay, I have to be more deliberate about the path that I'm carving out. At that point, I proceeded with doing an MBA, but saw in parallel that there was this big wave in terms of new tech roles, right? Where data science was one of those. Of course, the practice of using stats and things like that has been around for a long time, but it's really the confluence of big data and stats and programming that created that new role. And so I leaned into that wave, and really taught myself pretty much how to program and do things that the job called for. And sure enough, landed in tech and have really enjoyed the ride since.
Absolutely. Well, that's a really awesome kind of perspective there, and the path that you've taken so far. And kind of wanted to touch on a point about being intentional about where you end up, and sometimes having to go through roles that might not be your end goal. Trying to get some skills to pivot into new areas, and that's something that I'm actively trying to do is kind of break into roles through maybe a non-standard path at certain points. But I know that early in your career. You did some things with like localization, project management, some engineering roles. Could you kind of get into, how those early roles shaped the way you think about data problems and kind of maybe things that weren't super applicable immediately, but things that kind of stayed with you in terms of conceptual or system design, etc.
Absolutely. Yeah, those were formative years. I mean, I think in the moment, I realized that it was not the long-term path I wanted to pursue. And nowadays, I'm sure you feel it, as they say, your career is much less of a kind of linear career ladder that you're climbing. It's much more of a jungle gym where, there's lots of pivots and turns and, changes along the way. But even with many of those pivots, you'll see that you will keep a theme, a certain arc in your broader career trajectory. And those years for me were formative in the sense of getting early exposure to software, the software development cycle and how tech companies operate with much more of an agile mindset, which I think is only increasing now in the age of AI, where you can prototype that much faster and spin up a kind of a rudimentary version of a product very quickly. And for me, I think the main theme that stuck throughout my career was exposure to how different cultures operate, right, and bringing the cultural norms of different countries into the way that products are built, right. So in some cases, some cultures prefer having a much more kind of conversational, like kind of informal way of using a product. Other cultures prefer a more formal version, and I really enjoyed bringing that kind of cultural aspect into product development and tech.
Awesome. And I'm glad you kind of mentioned that culture aspect because that's a part of your path I do think is very interesting. And, I know that's something that at Meta, you were focused on the Latin America strategic partnerships and then working across those lines. Could you kind of dive just even a little bit deeper into, what does data science look like working across different market dynamics and things like that, especially within the data side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. And just for background, I'm originally from Brazil, so that's why you see some of that theme and kind of the jobs I've taken on. Um, and when I moved to the U.S., I felt like an outsider. I was kind of getting used to the culture, and then over time, when I would go back to see family and friends in Brazil, I was getting out of touch with kind of the local norms, and I realized that I felt kind of like a gringo, as they say, a little bit of an outsider. Felt challenging at the time, but I realized that was a forcing function to become um, globally minded and be able to adapt to different cultures and norms. And I've really enjoyed kind of bridging, different cultures. So my work today, I get to work with the broader ecosystem, right? So if you think of these companies like Meta or Google or comparable, they have their applications, their content that they serve, but really it requires a huge collaboration with the broader ecosystem, whether it's device manufacturers or the connectivity layer of like internet service providers that bring you the apps and content that you might enjoy. So a lot of the work has been focused on that aspect, and I've seen firsthand how when you engage with different businesses or professionals across different countries, how much you end up adapting your style based on those local norms. So it's been fun to see that.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense, and that's a very interesting perspective that I think something that's very valuable. I've only been out of the country once. I've been to Colombia in South America, so that was just an amazing experience. I really wanted That's something I want to do is travel more and kind of gain a better appreciation for other cultures and understanding other norms, and so that's something that I kind of want to emulate, kind of that worldwide business citizenship where these, especially with tech companies the size of Meta, things are global. It's not uh, completely local, which is something that I'm, not as used to and not as plugged into. So that's definitely a route that I want to explore and get better at. So I think that's a very cool perspective that you've taken on there.
Absolutely.
And now just kind of getting into more of your progression, what you do now, where you work at like the staff level. I know that's a lot higher up than just, your everyday engineering problems and comes with a whole host of new challenges and cool things to think about. So I was just curious, what does maybe a day in the life or what does, championing AI readiness across a data science org look like from that kind of level of thinking and practice?
Yeah. Well, it's a very I think you could answer that question in kind of the standard, like what does a staff level professional do? But I think now with the interplay with AI, it's a very interesting time, and certainly can appreciate the challenge of starting out your career and trying to find direction with all the disruption that's happening, right? And I experienced that as well in a different way in my work. I think for the staff level piece, it's I think one thing that I was wrong about in my career is that early on I thought, if I just become really technical and I've never been the kind of person who enjoys marketing or sales or something like that. It's just not the way I'm wired. And so I thought, hey, if I just learn stats, learn programming, and get really technical, then my work will speak for itself, right? And to some extent, that was true early on, but the more you rise to the senior ranks in your career, you'll see that it really is all about people skills. I don't like the term soft skills, but I think metacognitive skills, whether it's being able to be adaptive or build relationships, influence people, think creatively about the problem. And so at the staff level, it really is much more about kind of seeing the big picture, being able to help find the right architecture to how to solve a problem. It's a mix of execution and kind of big picture thinking. Um, Being able to be adaptive in terms of kind of how I communicate with senior level executives in the company versus folks who are more operational. So a lot of bridging that happens, a lot of context switching. I think AI, it's gone from, okay, this is interesting, and can use it for drafting an email, for kind of like summarizing some text, to really in the last month or two fundamentally shifting the way that we work and the workflows that we have. um, I think with Claude Code and like these kind of developments around AI that have been very powerful, it really is a different way of working. So, you hear a lot in the news about, wow, like software developers are really not coding as much. Like they don't really write that many lines of code. They're mostly just managing AI systems and reviewing AI generated code. And for data science, there's some of that as well. But actually, I think the more um, maybe surprising piece that's not talked about as much is this idea of creating a digital second brain, which sounds very fancy, but really the idea is that you organize context about not just your projects, but also maybe performance reviews and your career goals and aspirations, um, and using AI in the right way, kind of with the right context. It's able to be there really as a thought partner to how to approach project completion or career growth, and it learns and develops over time. So the bigger shift at the staff level has been to help people adopt this different way of working, not just for things like code completion, but also this idea of a extension of your brain, so to speak, which has been pretty cool and has certainly fundamentally shifted the way that I work.
Yeah, that's super interesting, especially kind of hearing that from your perspective in the staff level, because some of what you said kind of I relate to a lot in terms of, where I am at, and, I'm sophomore in college. Things are very disruptive, as you said, trying to figure out what to attach myself to, what route to go down. So I've been, obviously I've been using Claude Code and this and that and trying everything, just trying to, not get left behind as part of it. But that thing about the second brain is actually really interesting to me. It's something that is kind of a side project I've worked a lot on because I don't know, as a kid, I watched Iron Man and I really liked Jarvis and
Yeah,
that kind of system. So I've been like kind of experimenting, kind of building my own, kind of second brain around Claude Code and Obsidian. And it's really cool to see, what building context and using AI not just to, do the technical tasks, but also kind of keep you organized is really powerful. And it's something that I've really found a lot of fascination in, and it's something that I'm having fun experimenting with. So it's really cool to kind of hear you talk about that too. So
exactly. And as you're finding, it's not necessarily about you becoming more technical, but it's really about organizing the right context and like finding creative ways to weave that into your daily life, whether it's task management or maybe streamlining the way that you create your podcasts. Um, so yeah, the main thing is to dive in, experiment, and by the way, the feeling of that you're behind on AI, everyone feels that. There's no one that's like, oh yeah, I'm fully on top of it. So it's very very normal to feel that.
awesome. Well, I appreciate, the kind of the comforting there because sometimes, it is, again, from my perspective, it's a
Very
lot. And I know
fast
it
evolving.
is from, yeah, absolutely. So now kind of pivoting to outside of your, your corporate meta career, I do know that you do kind of a lot of cool things outside of that. So I wanted to kind of get into kind of a bit that you touched on there some of these higher level thinking abilities, not necessarily soft skills, but these meta skills, things like that. And I know one of the ways you kind of incorporate that is through the Yale's strategic decision making course that you help lead and teach for five or so years. So I was just kind of curious, taking that lens, what are some decision frameworks or some conceptual foundations that you've used and kind of applied in your own career?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I think the field of decision sciences has always been very interesting to me. And whether you go back to foundational authors, maybe you've heard of Daniel Kahneman, who wrote this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is really about how we have different ways of processing information or making decisions. One is very quick-witted, reactive, a little bit lazy in the sense of kind of like just using kind of like past decision rules that have worked and you kind of just apply them roguely versus system two that's a little bit more thoughtful, deliberate, takes more energy. And then there's offshoots of that. Maybe you've heard of authors like Annie Duke, which is she was a former poker player who became an expert in decision sciences, which is maybe kind of a not the most obvious career path to the point of career being a career jungle these days. But super interesting, bringing concepts of probability theory and kind of simulation of different potential outcomes, and applying that to the decision field, right? There's lots of frameworks that I found somewhat helpful, but I think really the most useful takeaway from the work I've done is not so much a framework they could show you, like present on a slide deck, but it's really what's behind it, right? So it's a lot of it has to do with understanding uh, our biases. We use mental shortcuts called heuristics
Mhm.
um, all the time, and they can be useful. They're not always bad or wrong, but they can be misguided. So whether it's recency bias, where we give more weight to kind of recent happenings rather than things that happened in the past, or confirmation bias, where we're kind of locked into a particular view, and then finding kind of evidence that confirms that further. Um, or resulting bias has been especially interesting for me to explore. Resulting bias is basically where we assign the quality of an outcome based on, or sorry, the quality of a decision based on the outcome rather than the process that went into it, right? So an example would be like maybe you say, hey, I have a little bit of spare money, I want to invest it in this like very speculative, maybe like cryptocurrency, and it does very well a month later, and you're like, wow, that was a great decision. But really the process, like if you actually think methodically, was that the right way to invest? Maybe you realize, no, it was not. It was just kind of by chance, right? And the opposite can be true as well, right? Where you have a bad outcome, but actually the decision process was sound, it was good. And so it's really a process of decoupling decisions in your career from the outcome versus like, given the information you had in the moment, did you make the right calls, the right decisions along the way? Again, it's I would say less about some cookie cutter framework about decision making and more about understanding those heuristics, biases that we have, and also limiting beliefs ultimately that we all hold.
Interesting. And that's it's again, it's kind of cool to hear you speak about that and how you've kind of been very interested in that because I feel like as the case with many of the things you've said, they're things that I'm also very interested in. Recently, I've been reading a lot about I'm blanking on his name, the Warren Buffett's, kind of second in command, who really talked about mental frameworks a lot. I've been diving into a lot of that, and then, like you said, heuristics and things that these biases that are always working in the background, but if you don't notice them, they're kind of controlling your life without you really realizing it. So that's something that I also think is fascinating. So that's really cool perspective on that you've given, and I'm excited to kind of learn more and continue involved in that, especially when I get into my career, where things are even more, applicable and very cool to see there. So thank you again for kind of sharing that. And it's very clear that, from our conversation that you're definitely a great communicator. You have a great way of teaching and giving advice. So I know that definitely translates well to another thing that you do, which is, your modern way coaching. So I know you've mentored countless professionals and through career transitions, advice, interviews, promotions. I'm sure you've seen a lot of cool things, met a lot of great people through that. So I was just curious, in your experience, what are some maybe common mistakes or just common themes along with that you kind of touched on that comes within early tech and your early career mistakes in general?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, just to talk a little bit about the coaching practice itself, for me, it wasn't that I just woke up some morning and said, "Oh, I want to become a career coach," but it happened organically, right? Where I started to work with folks who are in different stages of their careers, and I enjoyed being a sounding board and offering thought leadership based on challenges I've had because if it hasn't been clear already, like even though I've been able to build a career that I'm proud of, many moments felt very challenging, very uncertain, very lonely, um, and I'm grateful for those, right? Because that's often where the richest learnings come through. And if my career had felt very easy along the way, then I probably would not be able to, kind of share perspective. So but my coaching practice grew, and I've been able to work with hundreds of professionals navigating different challenges, whether it's breaking into their first job, out of college, trying to find direction, or someone who is midway through their career and feeling stuck, feeling like they fit a ceiling on their growth, or dealing with a difficult manager, politics of a company, trying to make a pivot, transition. Often those are very lonely moments where a professional might have a lot of good friends, family who cares about them, but they're not really able to support them in kind of those challenging professional questions. And then the professional peers you have in the company you might work for, they see you kind of within the role that you're in, and they're not. So there's kind of a gap that I think mentorship has been really important to me along my journey, and I have enjoyed also, being able to pass that on. Um, but yeah, to answer your question more directly, um, there's a lot of career mistakes I've seen people make. I think one of them is that people tend to have a very narrow view of their careers. The first question I like to often ask for new folks that I meet is, hey, if you had 1 hour of spare time, like let's say it's Thursday afternoon, you're done with your main work projects, like before you start your whatever social commitments for the evening, um, you have 1 hour to invest in your career. What would you do? Right. And often people think, maybe I would polish my resume, or I would apply for a job, or I would, something. And the answers almost always feel very narrow. They feel like very like task oriented and not holistic, right? If I change the question and say, hey, like let's say you're getting ready for a marathon, like you decide you want to do a marathon, you say, hey, how would you prepare for it? You'd be much more methodical. You'd say, I would have a game plan, I would train like this in week one, this in week two, etc. Think about your diet, think about your running training, and so forth. And I think for our careers, we don't have the holistic view often, right? And so um, some ways that you might think about it more broadly is that there's a few core pillars of your career. And right now you're in school, or you're learning many of the technical skills, for example. That's certainly one pillar, which is like kind of the core competencies that you have, the skills. But beyond that, I would suggest that you also think about number two, um, the what I call the engine, which is like just kind of a foundation of well-being, of having enough energy, motivation, taking care of your life more broadly. Number three is what I call the compass, which is Are you able to take a step back and understand where things are headed? Do you have direction, right? You might have a lot of motivation, but if you don't have direction, you'll shoot in a misguided direction, right? So that's one skill as well, to understand where is the industry headed, right? If you're in econ and stats today, what is happening? What's kind of the big wave that's on the rise, maybe along the lines of AI? Can you extrapolate that? Can you see what companies are hiring for? What are the main priorities, right? So be able to zoom out every so often, that's a really important skill. And then number four is your brand. It's what I call the signal. Are you able to build a dynamic brand where people find kind of what's unique about you? They understand your value proposition. It always starts from a place of authenticity, um, knowing your strengths and being able to, whether it's doing a podcast like you are, which is a great way to brand yourself early on, or thought pieces where you write, like, take an interesting stance on a given topic, but finding ways to build a brand. And then number five is the network, right? It's the people around you. And networking means not just meeting other professionals in your field, but it's having a mix, certainly of that, but also mentors or sponsors like within an organization who can help you navigate the politics of the place, build visibility for yourself. Um, so those are the kind of the core elements, right? And then from there, you turn those into goals, like not just outcome goals, which people often focus on, like the big outcome, like getting a promotion or getting the job, but also more of like the day in, day out kind of process focused goals or performance based goals, and making that a habit, just like you would if you were training for a marathon, right? So a bit long winded, but I hope that gives you a bit of a sense of how you can turn the main career mistake, which is being like too narrow in how one views their careers, and take more of a holistic view.
No, yeah, that's extremely helpful, and that's something that it's one of my favorite things is to watch, these interviews back and reflect on some things that maybe when I'm more focused about the conversation itself and then deep diving. So those are some things I'm definitely excited to kind of dive into and think about after look back over this, and I think that was definitely helpful, and um,
That's,
I
yeah.
really value that kind of perspective as well. So, thank you for that again.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say too is that there's a big irony where, often I work with data professionals, folks who are trained in data science or something along those lines. And there's this irony where they're very good at what they do, very data oriented in their work. But when it comes to their careers, I might ask basic questions about, like, hey, you're targeting XYZ company. What are they hiring for? Like, what are the main skills? Like, have you looked at their job profiles, and they're not very data oriented when it comes to their careers, right? So again, like, kind of goes back to our earlier conversation around blind spots and things like that. But yeah, it's interesting how we approach careers versus other parts of our lives.
Absolutely. And I think that also speaks to the importance, as you said, of mentors and networks to kind of help you spot those blind spots that you might not see. And it's been helpful for me so far. And I can see that that will be, very instrumental as I go forward. But kind of as I wrap up, just kind of getting into my last question, which you've already given me a ton of great advice, a lot of amazing information. But if you had to kind of distill it into, a sentence or two, based on, if you're in my shoes, and we wanted to build kind of this durable career, although it might be, a bit of a jungle at times instead of a narrow path. What advice would you give or things to focus on if you had to think about it in that way?
Sure. Yeah, and by the way, I'll answer the question, but I'm also curious, from conversations that you've had. You're very thoughtful and very proactive about reaching out to many folks who are working and maybe further ahead in their careers. Curious what you have picked up as being
Mm.
some of the strongest signal and kind of
Yeah.
the main lessons that you can anchor on. Um, but before that, from my view, I would say a few things. Number one is I don't know exactly what the right word is, but I think it's a mix of finding your authentic voice, of creativity, finding like a unique angle to a problem. It's a skill set. I would add maybe adaptiveness to that too. It's kind of a mix of a lot of these terms, where the professional that will be successful in the coming years is someone who is able to be very agile, adaptive, shift gears,
Mhm.
switch careers if needed, or lean into a new direction that's kind of trending in your industry. Um, and finding a unique angle, right? A great example is what you're doing today, which is doing outreach through a podcast, right? Where I think most other people in your shoes would, number one, maybe just not do any outreach, or like, I'm tired after my exams, I'm not going to worry about networking. Or number two, if they do network, it's kind of kind of the generic, let me just reach out randomly over LinkedIn, and like usually you don't hear back. So you are finding a unique angle to doing that in a way where clearly you're building traction, right? So that's number one. Number two, you have to become AI native. Everyone has to, right? And there's a lot of buzzwords in the field, like the 10x version of yourself. But I do believe that. I think AI can be a force multiplier where you are that much more productive. You are spending less time in kind of the weeds of things that would have taken very long before. You're weaving AI into the way you go about your task management, or how you streamline your podcast or studying for exams. That's the only way to really learn it from the inside out, is by, experimenting, and like learning the tools of the trade, of course. Um, and yeah, I think from there, it's really just about, kind of like having a very adaptive mindset, knowing that the job that you have maybe 5, 10 years from now might be a job that's brand new, something that doesn't even exist. And so the only thing you can do is really just embrace lifelong learning, and being very agile in your career.
Awesome. That's super powerful messaging there. And I really, appreciate that perspective. And as to your kind of question to me about, as through my conversations, it's funny because a lot of what you just got at are some things that I've seen throughout, all these conversations. Because obviously, everybody has their unique situation and unique advice to give, but just kind of some of the core things that I have noticed going through. The first one would be adaptability,
Mhm.
because almost everyone I talk to, wherever they've ended up in, usually it's been tech because that's just kind of where I've been trying to build, my foundation at this moment in time. A lot of them, may have started out in chemical engineering or economics or these fields that maybe not don't, maybe not computer science initially, that these things that weren't necessarily a clear path. And I think a lot of that comes down to them also not chasing, labels per se, and more chasing what they found passion in, and not really worrying about, the underlying technology or learning, Python is syntax super deeply, learning AWS, but learning kind of the underlying foundation of how to be a good system thinker, how to be a good technical leader. These things that maybe as it's been helpful for me because being I haven't really made this decision that I want to get into the technical field into tech for very long. So jumping in, it's something that I've found myself kind of thinking about like, oh, well, I just need to grind out Python for 5 hours a day. And then it's sometimes it's been good to hear that perspective of that's not really the underlying factor. So those are just kind of a couple of takeaways off the top of my head. But yeah, a lot of what you have been saying, different people have kind of has been very instrumental in different people's perspectives. So I think that's very cool how a lot of these underlying factors can affect people differently, and kind of be instrumental. You never know what, aspect of career growth and, what meta skill is going to be super helpful for your specific situation. I think that's also been kind of a cool perspective that I've gained through talking to people.
No, absolutely. I think it's spot on, right? I think I'll be honest that often in my career, I had a liberal arts formation, and for some time I thought, wow, maybe if I had gone more technical, kind of like a classic, I don't know, computer science route, that clearly was a very successful path
Mhm.
until AI became so disruptive, right? And I think now the skill set of the future is much more, to use your term, multidisciplinary, right? Where you're able to connect the dots across different disciplines, have a more of a holistic mindset, um, build more of that kind of orchestrator mindset where you're not necessarily like you're able to go into the weeds if needed, but you're also be able to see the big picture. Um, so yeah, I think that that skill set is evolving, and yeah, not surprised that you're hearing that general theme across the board.
Yeah, awesome to kind of hear you. It's good to hear that you kind of um, confirm that I'm not just taking the wrong messages away. So thank you again, for taking the time to meet with me today, and I really appreciated the conversation.
My pleasure. Really enjoyed it as well. Thank you, Ryan. I think you're off to a really great start to your early career.
Really appreciate it.